There are nights in Wyoming when the wind comes down off the mountains with a sound like grief, low and steady and impossible to ignore. It moves through the grass in long silver waves and finds every crack in every wall, reminding you that no matter how solid a thing appears, there is always a way in for the cold. Beckett Hargrove had learned that a long time ago. He was standing outside the telegraph office at Fort Laramie when that wind found him. It was past midnight. The sky above the Wyoming plain was the kind of dark that had weight to it, stars so thick and close they looked like something a man could reach up and disturb. The lamp above the telegraph office door threw a circle of yellow light onto the ground, and Beckett stood just at its edge, 1 foot in the light, 1 foot in the dark, the way he'd been standing most of his life. In his left hand was a piece of paper, one page, a few lines of legal language that he had read 4 times and understood completely. If he signed it and the case went wrong, Broken Spur Ranch would pass out of the Hargrove name for the first time in 22 years. The land his father had cleared by hand. The house his father had built one timber at a time. The fields his father had watered with something closer to blood than sweat. His right hand held the watch. It was a silver pocket watch worn smooth on one side from years of being held. His father's watch. The inscription on the inside cover was short. A man's word is his bond. His father had believed that the way other men believed in Scripture, which was to say completely without condition, without needing proof. Beckett had inherited the watch the same way he'd inherited everything else by arriving too late. He stood there in the Wyoming dark and let that thought move through him the way it always did, familiar and unhurrying like water finding its level. Then he looked through the window of the telegraph office. Inside, a woman sat at the small desk the operator had cleared for her. She was not crying. Marin Calloway had not cried once in the 3 weeks Beckett had known her, and he doubted she would start tonight, not here, not in front of strangers. She sat straight-backed and still, her dark coat drawing no warmth from the single lantern on the wall, and in her lap she held a Bible all battered, the brown leather cover cracked at the spine. Her hands rested on it the way hands rest on something sacred. Not reading it, just holding it, the way you hold the last thing that was touched by someone you'll never see again. She was waiting for him to come inside and sign the paper. She hadn't asked him to. She hadn't said anything about it. She had only looked at him once through the glass, and in that look was nothing he could describe as need. Marin Calloway did not ask for things with her eyes or her words or any visible part of herself. But he knew. The way you know certain things about certain people, not because they've told you, but because you've been paying close enough attention for long enough. He opened the watch one more time. A man's word is his bond. He thought about his father. He thought about a cup of coffee still warm on a kitchen table and a wall calendar still turned to March. He thought about arriving home to a house that was exactly as it had been left, silent and unchanged, waiting for a man who would not be coming back. He thought about a girl in Boston reading letters that never arrived. Then he folded the watch into his palm and walked inside. That was 3 weeks from the moment this story truly begins. But to understand why Beckett Hargrove signed that paper without hesitation, you have to go back to the beginning. You have to go back to a kitchen table in October, a blank piece of paper, and a man who had never once in his life written a letter to a woman he hadn't met. The night Beckett sat down to write, the temperature had already dropped below freezing, and the wind was testing the south wall of the Broken Spur Ranch house the way it did every October. Not to warn you, but to remind you. Winter in Wyoming did not ask permission. It arrived, and you were ready or you weren't. He'd been meaning to write the letter for a week. His 3 younger brothers had already sent theirs. Grady had sealed his before the ink was properly dry. Fletcher had rewritten his twice and read it aloud to the horses. And Theo had spent 2 evenings composing something so careful and considered that it read in Grady's words like a legal document for a pleasant woman. Beckett had read them all. Then he'd looked at his blank page. He was not a man who struggled with words as a matter of pride. He simply had no practice with the kind of words this required. The only writing he'd done in recent years was in ledgers and letters to the bank. Straight lines of fact and figure. No room for the other kind of language. He placed the pen on the paper and started with the only honest thing he knew. The ranch was real. The need was real, and he was asking for a partner, not a prize. He wrote that plainly without apology. He wrote about the land, 260 acres along the eastern edge of Copper Creek Valley grass that ran gold in September, cottonwood trees along the water that turned the color of fire in October. He wrote about the mornings. He didn't know why he wrote about the mornings. It wasn't strategic. He simply found when he sat alone in that kitchen at 10 o'clock at night with his brothers asleep and the wind outside, that the thing he most wanted to put into a letter was the way this place looked when the world was still dark and the first edge of light appeared over the eastern ridge. He wrote about the sound the cattle made before they could see the sun. He wrote about the cold coming off the creek in a low mist that sometimes reached all the way to the porch. He wrote about the particular silence that existed in those minutes before the day began, a silence that was not empty but full of something he'd never found a word for. He sealed the letter before he could think twice. 3 months of correspondence followed. He had not expected that. The Matrimonial Gazette was not a literary institution. But the woman who answered a Margaret Calloway from Boston, who signed her letters simply as Marin wrote back, with the same attention he'd put into his, and after the second exchange, he found himself reading her letters more than once. She wrote about practical things, what she knew how to do, what she was willing to learn, what she expected, and what she did not. But beneath the practicality was something else, a precision. An economy of language that told him she chose her words carefully the way people do when they've learned that words can be taken from you. He didn't know what he was reading between the lines. He just knew he kept looking. By the third month, he knew she feared the dark, but not thunder. He knew she went to bed late when something weighed on her. He knew she drank her coffee black because sweetness made her drowsy, and that she had learned to read mechanical drawings from a father she wrote about with a careful, deliberate quietness, the kind of quiet that meant pain. He wrote back every time. He did not think of it as more than correspondence. He did not examine it too closely. He was a practical man from a practical line of men, and the practical truth was that Broken Spur Ranch needed more than 4 brothers could manage alone, and a letter was a letter, not a promise. He told himself that until the morning of October the 14th, when he stood on the platform at Copper Creek Station with his pocket watch in his hand and realized his breathing had gone strange. The train arrived 30 minutes late, which was early for Wyoming. The platform was empty except for the 4 Hargrove brothers. Grady had combed his hair twice and denied it both times. Fletcher had picked up and set down a small bunch of dried wildflowers from the station's edge until Theo gently took them from him and put them in his coat pocket. Theo himself stood slightly apart, wearing the expression of a man who has prepared for every eventuality and is concerned this may be a 5th one. Beckett stood at the front. He had the watch in his left hand and his hat in his right, and he was watching the track curve to the north where it disappeared behind a limestone ridge, and he was not thinking about anything at all, which was how he handled the things that mattered most. The train came around that curve in a cloud of steam and iron sound, and the platform shuddered under their feet. Then it stopped. The steam cleared. The first person to step off was a woman. She was perhaps 5'4", dark-coated against the October cold with hair the color of old cedar, pulled back beneath a traveling hat that had survived the journey with more dignity than most. She stood on the platform a step for one moment before descending, not hesitating, assessing. Her eyes moved across the platform quickly, the way eyes move when they've been trained by necessity to note everything immediately. Then they found Beckett. She came down the steps. Beckett recognized her the way you recognize a voice you've only heard in your head. The match was not physical. It was something harder to name. She had the eyes of someone who had been thinking clearly for a very long time, under conditions that did not make thinking easy. They were gray-green and direct, and they met his without performance. She almost smiled. He was aware distantly that his breathing had not returned to normal. Then the second woman stepped off the train, then the third. Then after a pause, the 4th youngest, with a hat slightly askew and a look of pure, unguarded wonder at the Wyoming sky. 4 women. The platform went quiet in a particular way, the kind of quiet that happens when something expected has been replaced by something else entirely, and the mind requires a moment to adjust. It was the wagon driver, an older man named Orvis, who had been hauling freight between Copper Creek and the station for 11 years, who broke the silence. "Well," Orvis said from the seat of his wagon at the platform's edge, "looks like a match set to me, all 4 addressed to Broken Spur Ranch." Nobody answered him. Marin Calloway stood before Beckett, Hargrove, and looked at him the way she'd looked at the platform, directly, without apology, and with a steadiness that told him she had anticipated this moment and had decided how she intended to carry it. "Mr. Hargrove," she said. Her voice was lower than he'd expected, and clear. "I know this is not what you were prepared for. I'll explain everything on the ride back. I only ask that you allow us that far." It was not a request dressed as a statement or a statement dressed as an apology. It was exactly what it was: one person asking another for a fair hearing. Beckett Hargrove looked at her for a long moment. Then he turned to Orvis. "Help us get the trunks loaded." The road from Copper Creek Station to Broken Spur Ranch ran south for 2 miles, then cut west along the bottom of the valley for 4 more, following the creek. In October, with the cottonwood stripped and the grass tall and pale on either side, it was a drive that reminded a person of scale: the scale of the land, the scale of the sky, the smallness of any one set of concerns against the width of the Wyoming plain. Beckett drove. Marin sat beside him on the front bench. Behind them, in the wagon bed among the trunks, his 3 brothers sat with her 3 sisters in an arrangement of careful, polite silence that would not last longer than another mile. The creek ran to their left. The wind had dropped. The late afternoon light was going gold. She spoke first, and she spoke without preamble. Her 3 sisters could not remain in Boston. She had been their primary support since their father's death 18 months earlier, and the arrangements their guardian had put in place — she used the word guardian with a flatness that contained something sharper — were not arrangements she was willing to accept any longer. The 3 girls were her responsibility. She had seen the Hargrove name listed in the Matrimonial Gazette, alongside 3 others, all at the same address, all looking for wives. She had written to each of Beckett's brothers separately under their names from separate addresses, spacing the letters so they would not arrive together. It had taken 6 months of planning and the last of what Gerald Calloway had left his daughters, which was not much, to put 4 women on a train to Wyoming. She told him this without emotion, which was not the same as telling him without feeling. He understood the difference. "You planned this," he said. "I survived this," she said. He watched the road ahead. The creek made a sound over the stones on the left. The horses moved in their steady rhythm. He thought about the letters, 3 months of them. He thought about the precision of her language and why she chose her words the way she did, and he thought he understood a little better now. "The 3 of them," he said. "They have no one else." "No." "And you—" She looked at the road. "No." They rode in silence for a while. Not an uncomfortable silence, a thinking silence. At some point, not meaning to, he opened the watch in his palm, a habit so old it was automatic, the way some men press a thumb against a scar. She saw it. He saw her see it. She did not ask. He didn't explain. But later, much later, he would think that was the moment something shifted in the composition of the air between them. Some small but significant rearrangement, invisible and permanent, the way a single stone moved can change the course of a stream. The Broken Spur Ranch house was large by Wyoming standards and plain by every other measure log. Construction, low ceilings. A main room that served as kitchen and dining and parlor combined a long back hall with 4 doors and a front porch that faced east, so that whoever rose earliest got the full benefit of the dawn. Beckett's father had built it for function, and it had functioned faithfully for 22 years. It had not, in all that time, housed 8 people. The first week was a study in adjustment. 8 people moving through a space designed for 4 produces a particular kind of choreography, constant, improvised, conducted without a score. Shoulders turned sideways in doorways. Meals required 2 sittings. The single washroom off the kitchen became a matter of international diplomacy. Beckett, who had spent 14 years moving in and out of this house with the ease of complete familiarity, found himself uncertain for the first time of where to stand in his own kitchen. It was not unpleasant. That surprised him. Marin approached the arrangement with the same direct practicality she'd brought to every other element of this situation. Within the first 2 days, she had reorganized the kitchen in a way that made it work for 8 people, rather than 4, had identified which of the supply stores were running low and calculated how far into winter the current stock would take them, and had begun quietly, without announcement, learning the particular schedule of the ranch, what happened when, who was responsible for what, where the pressure points were. She did not ask his permission to do any of this. She did not ask his permission for anything. She simply looked at what needed doing and did it, and He understood watching her that this was not assertiveness for its own sake. This was what 8 years of being the only responsible person in a household looked like from the outside. He recognized it because it looked like him. The mornings were where they found each other. Before the others were up in that particular pre-dawn quiet that Beckett had described in his first letter, there was a stretch of 20 minutes where the kitchen belonged to whoever got there first. He always got there first. And then starting on the third morning, so did she. They did not discuss this. She poured herself coffee from the pot he'd already made, stood at the east window while it was still dark, and watched the same line of ridge that he watched. They did not speak much. The silences between them were the productive kind, the kind where both people are present, rather than simply occupying the same space. On the fifth morning, she was holding the old Bible. He noticed it the way you notice something a second time that you saw the first time and filed away. He'd seen it when she stepped off the train, seen it in her room when he'd carried a trunk in, and now here it was in her hands in the pre-dawn kitchen. She wasn't reading it. She was holding it the way he held the watch, with both hands, against her chest. He looked at her holding that book and looked away and said nothing. But he thought about it later. Around them in their own register, the other 7 found their rhythms. Grady had declared war on Cecily within 12 hours and fallen entirely under her influence within 48, though he would not have phrased it that way. She corrected him constantly, his knot, tying his fence repair, his method of stacking hay, and was almost always right, which enraged and captivated him in equal measure. He began finding reasons to be wherever she was working, which she ignored with a thoroughness that delighted him. Theo found Petra in the small collection of books Beckett kept on the shelf above the fireplace. She was not reading them. She was sketching in a journal, seated cross-legged on the floor. With the firelight on her face, and the sketch she was making was not a portrait or a landscape, but a technical drawing. Precise lines, measured angles, the kind of drawing that required an understanding of proportion and structure. Theo stood in the doorway and looked at it long enough that she eventually looked up. "It's architectural," he said, which was not what he'd intended to say. She nodded. "I learned from watching my father work." He came in and sat in the chair near the fire and picked up a book he didn't read for the next hour. Fletcher, who had never been complicated about anything, helped Hattie carry water from the creek and showed her how to check the garden beds for frost damage. And she showed him the names of constellations from a small book she'd brought from Boston, and that was essentially all that needed to happen between the 2 youngest of them, at least for now. And Beckett and Marin met at the east window every morning in the dark and said little and watched the light come up over the ridge, and that was enough. Until the 10th day. Theo rode into Copper Creek for supplies on the morning of the 10th day. He was back by mid-afternoon with flour lamp oil, 2 spools of wire, and a letter. It had no return address. The postmark was Boston. He handed it to Marin without comment. She took it with a hand that was steady to look at and not steady beneath the surface, he saw that much. Then he went to put the horses away and did not look back. She read it alone in the small room she shared with her sisters, the door pulled shut. Then she carried it to the kitchen stove and dropped it in. The paper caught and curled and was gone in under 10 seconds. Petra saw this from the hallway. She said nothing. She went back to her room. That evening after supper, after the dishes were done and the fire was banked, and the others had gradually drifted towards sleep, Marin went out to the front porch. She brought the Bible. She sat in the chair farthest from the door in the corner, where the porch railing met the wall, and she held the book in her lap and looked out at the dark. The night was clear and very cold. The stars above Copper Creek Valley were the kind that exist only at altitude and distance from any human light, total indifferent, beautiful in the way that things are beautiful when they have no interest in being observed. She was not reading. Beckett came out an hour later on his way to check the barn. He saw her sitting there and altered his course to walk past her and say nothing, which was what he would have done for anyone left them alone with whatever they were carrying. But he took 2 steps past her chair and stopped. He didn't know why he stopped. He couldn't have told you. He turned and came back and sat on the top porch step, 3 feet from her chair, his back to her and his face to the dark. He rested his arms on his knees. He did not ask her anything. After a long while, she let out a breath, not a sigh exactly, more like the sound of something being set down. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for sitting there." He nodded once to the dark in front of him. They sat for another half hour. Then he went to check the barn and she went inside and neither of them said anything more about it. But something had been established between them that evening, something that had no name yet and didn't need one. On the 14th day, Theo rode into Copper Creek for the afternoon post and came back with a different kind of news. He waited until supper was done and the younger ones were otherwise occupied before he spoke to Beckett quietly at the back of the main room. "There's a man in town," Theo said. "Arrived 2 days ago. Staying at the boarding house on Garrett Street. He's not from here." "Nobody's from here," Beckett said. "I mean, he's not from anywhere in the West. City suit, good shoes. He spent the afternoon in the saloon, and he wasn't drinking, he was listening. He asked Mrs. Briggs at the dry goods store about the new arrivals at Broken Spur." Theo paused. He asked about the women specifically. Beckett was quiet for a moment. "Did he give a name? Holbrook. He told Mrs. Briggs he was a business associate of a friend of the family. She told him we'd all been very pleased to have the ladies arrive." Theo's voice was dry. "She meant well. I know she did. Beck." Theo used the shortened name carefully the way he used all words, not without feeling, but with precision. "Marin received a letter from Boston 4 days ago. She burned it immediately. She didn't tell anyone what it said." Beckett looked across the main room to where Marin was speaking quietly with Cecily near the window. Her back was straight. Her expression was composed. There was nothing in her posture that would have told a stranger she was anything but entirely at ease. He'd spent enough time in her company to know that this meant nothing at all. It was past 10 o'clock when the last lamp went out in the back of the house and the ranch went quiet. Beckett was at the kitchen table with the account ledger open in front of him when the soft knock came at his door. He was not surprised. He had been waiting in the way you wait for things you sense are coming without naming them. He said, "Come in." Marin stood in the doorway. She was still dressed. She held the Bible against her side with one hand, and with the other she held the edge of the doorframe, not leaning on it, but touching it, a small, uncharacteristic gesture, like someone who needed to know the wall was solid. "I need to tell you something," she said. "All right." She came to the table and sat in the chair across from him and placed the Bible on the table between them. Not as a prop, not for effect. It was simply something she carried everywhere, and she set it down the way a person sets down what they carry when they're finally still. She told him. She began with her father, Gerald Calloway, who had spent 20 years building a reputation as one of Boston's most careful and original mechanical inventors, a man whose drawings filled notebooks that lined 3 shelves in his study, a man who believed that what you built with your mind was as real as what you built with your hands and deserved the same protection. She told him about Cornelius Aldgate, not the monster version, not yet, but the real version. First, a man who had been Gerald's closest friend since before Marin was born, a man her father had trusted completely, who had his own considerable financial mind and had grown Callaway Mechanical's commercial side into something neither of them could have managed alone. She told him about the patent of valve mechanism for high-pressure industrial steam systems, the kind of innovation that would be worth a considerable fortune as American industry expanded west. She told him how the patent filing had proceeded under both names, how the documentation had been handled on Aldgate's side of the partnership, and how it was therefore Aldgate, not Gerald, who held the original papers, how those papers could be arranged, how a second set of books could be created, how a man with 20 years of trust behind him could construct a narrative that would hold up in a Massachusetts courtroom backed by lawyers Gerald Calloway could not afford. Gerald was arrested in March of 1877. He died in prison 14 months later, not from violence but from a chest illness that went untreated because the prison physician had other priorities. He was 51 years old. After he died, Aldgate had presented himself to the 4 daughters as their natural protector, a grieving friend, a man of means concerned only with their welfare. What he was, in fact, was a man who understood that the Callaway name still had value, that the remaining notebooks contained work that hadn't been filed yet, and that 4 women without resources and without family were unlikely to resist the kind of sustained pressure that presented itself as generosity. "He has a legal guardianship," Marin said. "I'm not certain how he obtained it. Likely he didn't obtain it honestly. But it exists on paper, and paper has a way of being persuasive." She said this without bitterness, simply as a fact about the world, the way you state facts about weather or terrain, things that are not personal, only real. The man in town, Beckett said. Holbrook. He works for Pinkerton. Aldgate uses them when he needs something done at a distance. She met his eyes across the table. He knows where we are. He has known for some time, I believe. He waited to confirm it before sending someone. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the wind had dropped completely, one of those sudden Wyoming calms that felt less like peace than like the world holding its breath. Beckett looked at the Bible on the table between them. He thought about the way she held it. He thought about the letter she had burned. How long do we have? He said. I don't know, not long. He'll want to establish himself in the area before he acts, build relationships, make people comfortable with him. She paused. He's very good at that. He's been doing it with me my whole life. Beckett was quiet for a moment. He turned the watch over in his pocket, didn't take it out, just touched it through the fabric, an old habit. The ranch is in debt, he said. You should know that. Not catastrophically, but the margin is narrow. I know, I read the account ledger the first week. He looked at her. I wasn't prying, she said. I needed to understand the full situation. You could have asked. I was going to, when it became necessary. Something shifted very slightly in her expression, not quite an apology, not quite an explanation. I've learned to gather information before asking questions. It's a habit I developed when asking questions wasn't always safe. He held her gaze for a long moment. Then he nodded. A single deliberate nod, the kind that means I understand, not simply I hear you. This puts you in danger, she said. The sentence came out slightly different than the rest the control held, but not as easily. Your brothers, the ranch. None of this is what you agreed to. I want you to know that I understand what I brought here, and I understand if. Marin, she stopped. He had used her given name only twice before, both times without thinking about it. This time was also without thinking about it, which perhaps was the point. People who run scared make mistakes, he said. People who run scared make mistakes, and people who have everything chasing them make more of them than most. He leaned forward slightly. You didn't run scared. You planned for 6 months. You protected your sisters. You got everyone here without a single mistake. He paused. I'm not going to tell the best prepared person I've ever met that she should have done something differently. The lamp between them made the shadows move slowly. She sat very still for a moment. Then she picked up the Bible from the table and held it in her lap again. There's something else, she said quietly. Something in here. Something my father left. I'm not ready to say more about it tonight, but you should know it exists. He looked at the Bible. He looked at her. When you're ready, he said. He rose and carried his cup to the wash basin. He stood at the east window for a moment, looking out at the dark where the ridge would be when morning came. My father used to say, the land doesn't care about your problems, he said. He didn't mean it as cruelty. He meant that the land is still there in the morning regardless, that there's something reliable in that. He turned and looked at her across the kitchen. Whatever is coming, Broken Spur Ranch will still be here in the morning. She looked at him for a long time. Thank you, she said, the same words she'd said on the porch in the dark when he'd done nothing more than sit beside her. He went to bed. She sat alone in the kitchen for another hour holding the book, listening to the wind begin to come back down from the mountains, low and steady and patient, the way it always returned, the way everything in Wyoming eventually returned with no regard for what you thought you'd put behind you. Somewhere in the dark of Copper Creek Valley, a lamp was burning in a boarding house window on Garrett Street. A man named Holbrook was not sleeping, and 3 weeks later, Beckett Hargrove would stand outside a telegraph office at Fort Laramie with a pen in his hand and a piece of paper that asked him to wager everything his father had built. He would not hesitate. But that understanding, the full weight of it, the reason it came as easily as breathing that was still being built in pre-dawn kitchens and quiet front porches in silences that asked nothing and gave everything in the accumulation of small, ordinary moments that are in the end the only architecture that lasts. It was being built now. One morning at a time, Cornelius Aldgate arrived in Copper Creek on a Tuesday, which was fitting. Nothing in Beckett's experience had ever gone wrong on a Monday or a Friday. The bad things, the truly consequential ones, had a preference for the middle of the week when you were too far from the weekend behind you and too far from the one ahead to have your guard properly set. He came in a hired coach, not on horseback. That was the first thing people noticed. In Wyoming Territory in 1879, a man who rode a hired coach into a working town was either infirm or sending a message, and Allgate was neither infirm nor careless with the messages he sent. The coach was dark green, clean, and pulled by two matched bays that had no business being this far west. It stopped in front of the Copper Creek Hotel, the only hotel, a two-story clapboard affair that served three functions as hotel dining room, an informal community center, and Allgate stepped down with the particular ease of a man who has been comfortable in every room he has ever entered. He was 52 years old and looked 45. Silver at the temples, broad in the shoulders still. His clothes were Boston good wool, well cut, not ostentatious, and his face had the kind of settled authority that comes not from beauty, but from decades of being listened to. He stood on the Copper Creek boardwalk for a moment and looked at the town the way a man looks at a thing he intends to own, which was not with greed but with assessment. Patient, methodical, already calculating. He checked into the hotel under his own name, paid a month in advance, and asked the proprietor, a round, pleasant man named Dunham, where a person might find a decent meal. By the end of his first afternoon, he had eaten in the hotel dining room, introduced himself to four other diners as a businessman from Boston, traveling for personal reasons, mentioned with appropriate gravity that he was deeply concerned about the welfare of four young women. Orphans, really, who had been lured west under false pretenses by men he hesitated to call opportunists. But what else could you call them, and left an impression of such measured, reasonable concern that Mrs. Dunham told her husband that evening she felt genuinely sorry for the poor man. On the second day, he went to the dry goods store owned by the Briggs family and settled the Hargrove account in full, $47. He left $2 extra for the trouble of it and didn't wait for thanks. He told old Briggs it was simply the neighborly thing to do. On the third day, he walked into the First Territorial Bank of Copper Creek and spent 90 minutes in a closed meeting with the branch manager, a careful and moderately ambitious man named Andrews, who had inherited this position from a father who had understood Wyoming and had not quite managed to pass that understanding on. When Allgate emerged from that meeting, he carried a folded paper in his inside Briggs pocket. He walked to the hotel, ordered coffee, and sat alone by the window looking out at the main street of Copper Creek. And for a long moment, he did not look like a man who had just accomplished something. He looked like a man thinking about something that had nothing to do with business. It was a brief moment. His coffee arrived. He thanked the server, by name he'd learned all their names already, and turned his attention to other things. He was not a simple man. That would need to be said at some point to be honest about what happened and why. Simple men do simple damage. Allgate had done something far more intricate and far more complete, and the reason for it was not simple either. He and Gerald Calloway had been friends for over 2 decades, real friends, the kind that exist before either man has anything worth fighting over. When Gerald's mind had begun to show what it could do, the particular quality of his mechanical imagination, the way he saw solutions in 3 dimensions, where other men saw only problems, Allgate had been proud of him. Genuinely proud. He had said so. He had meant it. The trouble with genuine admiration, when it is held long enough alongside genuine ambition, is the slow and nearly invisible way it turns. Not overnight, not in a single moment of decision, over years. Over a dozen small occasions when Gerald's name was said with more enthusiasm in a room and Allgate's with slightly less. Over patent filings and industry dinners and the look on a particular banker's face when Gerald spoke about his latest work. The jealousy had been real. The friendship had also been real. Both things were true at once, which was what made it so difficult to reduce to a simple verdict. He had not intended for Gerald to die in prison. That much was true. He had intended for Gerald to be discredited and marginalized and manageable, and what happened after that was the consequence of a machinery he had set in motion and could not entirely control. He had not visited Gerald in prison. He had told himself it was because he knew Gerald would not want to see him. He had not examined that reasoning closely. Now he sat in the Copper Creek Hotel window and looked at the street and thought, as he sometimes did in unguarded moments, about a man who had trusted him, the way a man trusts a friend, completely without calculation, the way people trust things they've had long enough to believe permanent. Then he put that thought away. He was not here for Gerald. He was here for what came next. Andrews came to Broken Spur Ranch the morning after the Bible fell. He tied his horse at the gate post and came to the door with his hat in his hands, which Beckett had never seen him do. That was enough to know the visit was not routine. Beckett was out of the door before Andrews could knock. They spoke for 4 minutes beside the water trough, quiet enough that no one inside could hear. Andrews kept his eyes on the ground for most of it, the way men do when they are delivering news they wish they didn't have to deliver. When he finished, he looked up once, and the expression on his face was the specific expression of a man who has done something for practical reasons and has since become uncomfortable with those reasons. "I should have asked more questions when he came in," Andrews said. Beckett looked at him for a moment. "Go on home, Andrews." Andrews put his hat on and rode away without looking back. Beckett stood in the yard alone for a long moment. He looked at the east pasture, at the fence line he'd been mending, at the particular quality of the late morning light across the dry grass. Then he picked up his tools and walked back out to the fence, because the fence still needed mending, and because standing still with bad news has never made the news better. He was there an hour later when he saw Marin coming across the grass toward him, the folded paper held carefully against her side. The Bible had fallen the day before. Not dropped. Marin was not a person who dropped things. The edge of the kitchen table caught the spine of it as she reached past for the salt pot, and it struck the floor with a flat-weighted sound, and when Petra picked it up, the spine had split further along an existing crack, and a tightly rolled piece of paper had come free. It lay on the kitchen floor, small, perhaps 2 inches across when rolled. The kind of thing you could overlook, except that Petra knew her sister's habits around that book very well, and she had noticed for 2 years how carefully Marin held it, how precisely she placed it, how the spine was always turned inward. She had suspected something and said nothing. She was good at that. She picked up the paper and held it out. Marin looked at it for a moment. She picked it up. She unrolled it slowly. It was her father's handwriting. She sat down at the kitchen table. Petra sat beside her. A minute later, Cecily came in from the back room and read Petra's face and sat as well. Hattie came to the doorway, read the room, and came in quietly. The four of them sat around the kitchen table in the afternoon light, and Marin unrolled the paper fully. It was a full page, small-lettered, the handwriting precise and very careful, the kind of writing a person does when they are limited in paper and determined that every word should last. It was a map, not a geographical map, a reference map. Numbers corresponding to pages, letters corresponding to sections, abbreviated titles that made no sense without context. At the bottom in the smallest script, 2 words, Abernathy, Harbor. "The lawyer," Cecily said immediately. "Bernathy and Associates," Marin said. 14 Harbor Street. "He's been father's solicitor since before any of us were born." She set the paper flat on the table and pressed it smooth with her palm. The four of them looked at it. "Father kept duplicate records of everything," Marin said. Her voice was steady, but something in it had shifted a frequency change barely perceptible, like a string tuned 1 degree higher. Every notebook had a corresponding set of documents. He sent the copies to Abernathy for safekeeping years before any of this happened. He was meticulous. He always said that a man who builds things should build redundancy into everything, including the record of his own work. Petra was looking at the reference numbers on the page. These correspond to the patent filing, the original filing before Allgate's version. This is a guide to where the original documentation is kept. "Not just the patent," Marin said. "Everything, the progression of the work, every stage, every date, every decision, if it exists in Abernathy's vault. Then Allgate's version of events falls apart," Cecily said. The kitchen was very quiet. Hattie, who had been sitting at the end of the table with her hands in her lap, said softly, "He wrote this in prison. He knew." "Yes," Marin said. "He knew they might find us someday, and he wanted us to have something." "Yes." Hattie looked at her oldest sister across the table. "He was taking care of us, even then. He was still taking care of us." Marin looked down at the paper. She pressed it smooth again, though it was already flat. She did not say anything for a long moment. Then she folded the paper with great care, rose from the table, and went to find Beckett. He set his tools down when she was close enough to speak without raising her voice. She gave him the paper. She let him read it. He read it twice, the way he read everything important, once for the content and once for what the content meant. "Abernathy is still in Boston," she said. "I received a letter from him 8 months ago. A letter I was not supposed to receive. He sent it through Ruth Fenwick, who had no obvious connection to him. He told me the materials were secure and that he would hold them as long as necessary. She paused. I didn't know then what the paper... She stopped, started again more carefully. I didn't know what the paper in the Bible meant. I hadn't found it yet. I think my father assumed I would know to look. Does Aldgate know the records exist? He knows father was meticulous. Whether he knows about Abernathy specifically, I'm not certain. She looked at the East Ridge. But he knows he has a vulnerability somewhere. That's part of why he moved quickly. Beckett looked at the paper a third time. He was quiet for a while the way he was quiet when he was not absent, but working all the activity internal, none of it visible. Theo can draft a communication to the U.S. Marshal's office in Cheyenne, he said. If we can get a telegraph from Fort Laramie to Marshal Harrison with enough of the specifics, not everything, but enough we can establish federal attention on this before Aldgate has time to build the local infrastructure he needs. Fort Laramie is 18 miles. Yes. And there's still the question of the mortgage. He handed the paper back to her and was quiet for a beat. Andrews came this morning. Aldgate holds the note. Bought it Monday last. She received this without visible reaction. She had been preparing for it, he realized, in the way she prepared for everything, by thinking through the likeliest outcomes in advance so that when they arrived, they found her already standing. I wondered. The timing was right for it. She folded the paper again and held it carefully. Then he has two mechanisms of pressure, the guardianship order and the financial hold on the ranch. If he uses both simultaneously, he will. Then we have a narrow window before he can move in a way that becomes legally difficult to reverse. She looked at him. I'm sorry for all of it. I'm sorry that what I brought here has a Marin. She stopped. He picked up his tools. He set them in the box. He did this with the same unhurried deliberateness he brought to every physical task. And when he straightened, he looked at her across the few feet of dry Wyoming grass between them and said what he said simply and without preparation. Whatever that paper contains, it matters. Not just for you. Your father built something real, and it was taken from him, and he spent his last months in a prison cell, finding a way to make sure the truth of it outlasted what was done to him. He paused. That matters. It matters to me personally, and I intend to do something about it. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she nodded once and walked back toward the house with the paper held carefully against her side. He watched her go. Then he went to find Theo. He rode out to Broken Spur Ranch on the morning of the 17th day. He came with Sheriff Beckett and Agent Holbrook, which was the correct arrangement, two witnesses, one with legal authority, one with professional standing. The approach was deliberate. The timing was deliberate. Everything Aldgate did in the realm of conflict was deliberate because he had learned long ago that the man who loses his composure first has already conceded the most important ground. They came up the ranch road in the mid-morning light, the three horses moving at a measured pace. Beckett was in the yard when they arrived, having been told by Theo 40 minutes earlier that horses were coming up from the south. He had used those 40 minutes to say three things to Mern quietly at the kitchen table, and then to put on his hat and go outside to wait. All 8 people came onto the front porch. There had been no discussion about this. It simply happened the way certain things happen when people have been living in close quarters under pressure, a shared instinct, a closing of ranks that required no coordination because it required no thought. Aldgate dismounted and came toward the porch with his hat in one hand and his expression calibrated to the exact register of concerned affection. He was very good at this. He had been doing it for a long time. Eleonora, he said. He used the name with such careful warmth, the full name, the one nobody in this house used, the one she had not heard since Boston, that for a moment the porch was simply very quiet. Marin stood at the front of the group, one step ahead of Beckett, and the thing that crossed her face in that half-second was not visible to most of the people watching. But Beckett was standing close enough, and he had been paying close enough attention, and he saw it. He saw what it cost her to hear that name in that voice. Mr. Aldgate, she said. Not Cornelius, not the name of someone she had grown up calling by his given name in her father's parlor. Mr. Aldgate. The distance of it was precise and intentional and total. He came to the bottom of the porch steps and stopped there, and he let his gaze move across the group with the expression of a man deeply relieved to find what he was looking for. Then he looked at Beckett. I'm grateful to you for taking the girls in, he said. The word girls was chosen carefully, not women, which would have implied capacity and autonomy. But I'm afraid there's been a serious misunderstanding about the nature of the arrangement. He reached into his coat. I have legal documentation. Sheriff, if you'll examine these. He passed two documents to Beckett. The sheriff unfolded them with the slightly pained expression of a man who knows he is about to be put in a difficult position. The first was the guardianship order from the Massachusetts court. The second was a single page folded twice, which Beckett opened and then read a second time with his eyebrows slightly raised. It was a contract, dated November of 1877, 2 months before Gerald Calloway died. Signed with Gerald's name and Allgate's name side by side. The language was careful and the intention was unmistakable. In the event of Gerald Calloway's death, his eldest daughter, Margaret Calloway, upon reaching the age of 27, would enter into a formal arrangement of marriage with Cornelius Aldgate, as agreed between both parties for the mutual benefit and protection of the Calloway family. Marin was 27. She had turned 27 in September. The porch was completely still. This is a forgery, Marin said. Her voice was the same. Precisely the same as it had been 1 second before controlled clear, no elevation of register. But Beckett, 3 feet to her right, felt the change in the air beside her, the way you feel a temperature drop. My father did not sign this document. My father would not have signed this document. Margaret. Allgate's voice was gentle. That was the terrible part of it, how genuinely gentle it sounded. Your father was not well in those final months. He was frightened for you. He wanted to ensure you and your sisters were protected. By selling me. The words landed on the morning air and stayed there. Aldgate did not flinch. By securing your future. Beckett stepped forward 1 step to stand level with Marin rather than behind her. He addressed Beckett directly. Sheriff, these women are here by their own choice and they are here as intended as the betrothed of myself and my brothers. That is the arrangement they entered into and it is the arrangement that stands. Beckett looked from the documents to Beckett to Aldgate with the expression of a man standing in the middle of a river that is rising on both sides. Aldgate turned to him with a small, patient smile. Sheriff, I understand this is uncomfortable, but a legal document is a legal document. In Massachusetts, Theo said, he had stepped forward from the back of the group, unhurried in the particular way of someone who has been waiting for the moment a specific piece of information becomes relevant. The guardianship order is issued by a Massachusetts court, Theo said. That court has no direct jurisdiction in Wyoming territory. Enforcement of an out-of-state court order requires review and approval by a territorial judge. That process takes time, weeks at minimum. And a contractual document signed under contested circumstances by a man who was at the time in physical and psychological distress in a state penitentiary would be subject to significant challenge on grounds of coercion alone. He said this the way he said everything, not with performance, but with the flat, exact delivery of a person who has thought about this thoroughly and would be prepared to think about it more thoroughly if required. Aldgate looked at Theo for a moment. It was the briefest thing, a flicker of genuine reassessment, quickly replaced by the composed surface he maintained like a professional obligation. You've thought about this carefully, he said. I've had some time, Theo said. Beckett cleared his throat. Mr. Aldgate, I'll be honest with you. I'm going to need time to examine these documents properly and consult with Judge Farrell before I can act on any of them. Aldgate nodded with gracious patience. Of course, Sheriff, I understand completely. He turned back to the porch one final time. His eyes found Marin, and in that moment, just that moment before the composure settled back into place like water, something moved across his face that was not anger and not triumph and not anything as simple as cruelty. It was something older and more complicated, and it passed too quickly to name, but it left a trace. A man who had once saved another man's life, looking at the evidence of what he had done since. He put his hat on, turned his horse, and rode back toward Copper Creek. Holbrook rode behind him. The sheriff followed, casting one last uncomfortable look over his shoulder. When the sound of hooves had faded to nothing, nobody on the porch moved for a long count. Then Cecily said quietly, "He had that paper printed." "Yes," Marin said. "How long ago?" "Long enough that the paper aged correctly." She stepped back off the front step and turned to face the house. Her expression had not changed. It had not changed once. He's been planning this since before we left Boston. She went inside. Beckett stayed on the porch alone for a moment, looking at the road. Then he followed her. They sat together in the kitchen that night, not all 8 of them, but Beckett and Marin and Theo, with the lamp turned up and the reference paper spread on the table and a fresh piece of paper beneath Theo's hand. The others had gone to bed or given them privacy by instinct. It was nearly midnight when Beckett said the thing that had been in the room for an hour without being said. My father died in March of 1871. I was north of the Kansas line when I got the letter. He said it without preamble, the way he said things that cost him directly quickly, without the buildup that would have given the sentiment more room to gather. He'd been sick for 3 weeks. I didn't know. He wouldn't have sent word. He'd have known I had a bomb and wouldn't have wanted to pull me from it. That was his way. Theo had set his pen down. He looked at the table. I got back to the ranch on the 5th of April. Everything was exactly as he'd left it. The calendar was still on March. There was a cup on the kitchen table. A pause. Brief. He'd been alone the entire time. The lamp flame moved in a slow current of air from somewhere. I took off my badge that day. I never put it on again. I came back here and I've been here every day since, and I worked this land the way he worked it, and I tell myself it's because I'm honoring what he built, which is true, but it's also because I don't know another way to say I'm sorry. Marin had been looking at the table. Now she looked at him. He did not return the look immediately. He was looking at the wall at some middle distance. He did it the way men do who are not accustomed to speaking about the things that are most real to them, with their eyes somewhere neutral, as if the words need a clear path out and eye contact would close it. I never said that to him, he said. I never had the chance to say I was sorry for not being there. You don't get a second chance at that. You don't get to go back. He turned the watch in his pocket without removing it. You just carry it. The kitchen was very quiet. Then Marin said, my father wrote to me every week from prison, every week for 14 months. Her voice had the same quality as his direct, careful, the sentence moving forward without slowing, because slowing would cost too much. 1 letter a week. He would have sat at whatever surface they gave him, and he would have thought about us, about what he wanted us to know, what he wanted to say before time ran out. He would have been careful with every word. She set her hands flat on the table. I never received a single letter. Allgate controlled the correspondence. They were all, I don't know what happened to them. I don't know if they were destroyed or kept. I never read one. I don't know what he said. Her jaw was set very tight. I was right there in Boston, 20 minutes from where he was, and I never got to read one word that he wrote to me. The silence afterward had weight and texture. It was the kind of silence that exists after something true has been said, not comfortable, not uncomfortable, simply real. After a long while, Beckett said, both of us were cheated out of something that couldn't be replaced. She looked at the table. Yes, and neither of it was our fault. A long pause. Something in her face shifted slightly, not breaking, nothing so simple as that. More like the almost imperceptible movement of something that has been held rigidly in one position for a very long time, shifting just enough to change the balance. No, she said, neither of it was. He looked at her then, directly without the neutral middle distance. And she looked back at him in the lamplight, with no composure left to manage the expression on her face, and what was there was not grief exactly, it was older than grief. It was the face of someone who has been holding a weight alone for so long that they have forgotten it's heavy until the exact moment someone standing close enough reaches out and takes part of it. Theo, with the tact of someone who had watched these 2 people for 3 weeks and understood them both, gathered his papers quietly and said he thought he had enough to draft the telegraph message and would do it tomorrow morning. Neither of them said anything. He took the lamp from the corner and went to his room and left them the one above the table. The morning after that night came with a clarity that Wyoming mornings sometimes have, air so clean it had an edge to it, sky, a pale deep blue above the eastern ridge, the grass silver with frost that would be gone in an hour. It came the way mornings come after things have shifted in the dark, the same world, but the distances arranged slightly differently. Hattie's laugh reached the house from the yard before most people were properly awake. She had convinced Fletcher to let her try the bay gelding in the small paddock, and the result was exactly as predicted by every piece of available evidence. She made it around twice before the horse lost interest in cooperation, and she lost interest in staying on. And she landed in the frost-pale grass in a sitting position, with her hat over one eye and a look of such complete, uncomplicated delight that Fletcher laughed until he had to hold the fence post. Grady heard it from the barn and came out. He stood watching Cecily, who had come out to watch from the porch, watch Fletcher and Hattie, with an expression she was not fully managing. Grady leaned on the fence post next to Theo, who had come outside with his draft telegraph message and a cup of coffee, and said quietly, "I think I'm in love with her." Theo turned to Paige. The rest of the house arrived at that conclusion about 5 days ago. Grady was quiet for a moment. "Is it obvious?" "Only to anyone with eyes," Theo said, and went back to his draft. Beckett came out onto the porch and stood in the morning sun. Marin came to stand beside him, and he handed her one of the 2 cups of coffee he was carrying without saying anything, and she took it without saying anything, and they stood there in the October morning with the sound of Hattie's second attempt on the bay gelding floating up from the paddock. It was not a moment that resolved anything. The paper was still in the Bible. Allgate was still in Copper Creek. The mortgage note was still in the wrong hands. Nothing had been solved by a conversation in a lamplight kitchen, and nothing had been promised, and nothing would be simple about what came next. But the morning was still there, solid and indifferent and reliable in the way Beckett's father had meant when he said the land doesn't care about your problems, meaning not that it was cold, but that it persisted. It was there before the trouble began, and it would be there after. There was something load-bearing in that. The frost burned off the grass in long silver threads as the sun found the valley. From the paddock, Hattie landed for the 3rd time and began laughing before she hit the ground. 3 days later, Grady walked into the Garrett Street boarding house in Copper Creek and found Agent Holbrook in the small dining room off the front parlor. He had been watching Holbrook for a week, his movements, his habits, which chair he took at which table when he took his coffee. He had done this without anyone asking him to, because Grady Hargrove's considerable talent for reading people had spent most of his life being deployed at card tables, and he had recognized in Holbrook a particular quality that interested him, the quality of a professional who was becoming uncomfortable with his current employment. He put the translated version of the reference page on the table. He did not explain what it was immediately. He let Holbrook look at it. "My future father-in-law was the most careful man I never met," Grady said. "He documented everything, every stage of every project. 30 years of notebooks with corresponding duplicates kept in trust with a solicitor in Boston who is still alive, still practicing, and still holding what he was asked to hold." Holbrook looked at the paper. He looked at Grady. He was quiet for a moment. "Allgate knows about the solicitor," Grady said. "He can't destroy what's in that vault without a court order, and he can't get a court order without exposing exactly what he's trying to hide. So instead, he came here. He's trying to remove the people who know the vault exists, remove them from a position where they could ever petition for its contents." He leaned back. "You were hired to find 4 women. You found them. That job is finished. What's happening now is something different." Holbrook looked at the paper for a long moment. He was a careful man, not in the way of someone slow to understand, but in the way of someone who had learned that the first available interpretation of any situation was almost never the complete one. "The Pinkerton Agency," he said, "has been in business since 1850. Its reputation is its product." He paused. "I was engaged to locate 4 individuals and confirm their welfare. I have done that." Another pause. "What I was not engaged to do and will not do is provide cover for the suppression of material evidence in a fraud case." Grady picked up the paper and stood. "I thought that might be your position." "Mr. Hargrove." Holbrook looked up at him. "I'll need to make certain inquiries through proper channels. It will take several days." Grady nodded. "Take what you need." He left money for both their coffees and walked back into the October street. Allgate came to Broken Spur Ranch for the 2nd time on a Wednesday morning. He brought the same 2 men. This time he also brought the mortgage note. He came in the same measured way, 3 horses, mid-morning, nothing rushed. But when the 8 people assembled on the porch this time, the air was different. The patience was gone from it. Something had been decided, and everyone on both sides knew it. He stood at the bottom of the porch steps and spoke to Beckett directly. "The 60-day notice period under the mortgage agreement begins today," he said. He held up the folded document. The note is held by my firm as of Monday last. If it is not satisfied within that period, the property transfers under the terms of the original agreement. He put the document back in his coat. I take no pleasure in this, Hargrove. I want you to understand that. This isn't about the land. This is about my responsibility to people who were placed in my care and who have been removed from it by circumstances that don't reflect well on anyone involved. Beckett said nothing. Aldgate turned to Marin. His voice shifted, still measured but different in calibration. Come home, Eleonora. Bring your sisters. I'll settle the note, and there will be no further complication for this man or his brothers. None of this needs to continue. Marin stood at the front of the group and looked at him with the face she had assembled over the last 2 years for exactly this kind of moment, composed to the point of appearing carved. Beckett, to her right, had his hands at his sides and was very still. She felt him beside her, not moving, not speaking, waiting. She felt the weight of what it meant, the ranch, the note, the 60 days, what would happen at the end of 60 days if the legal proceedings went wrong. She understood the mathematics of it precisely. She had understood them since the morning Andrews came to the door. She looked at Aldgate. She looked at the man who had known her since before she could read, who had sat at her father's dinner table and called him friend, who had spent the last 2 years positioning himself as her protector while dismantling everything her father had built and everything her father had been. She thought about the cup on the table in Beckett's kitchen, still on march. She thought about a man in a prison cell writing letters every week that no one ever received. She looked at Beckett. He looked at her. And in his face was the same thing that had always been there, not asking anything, not directing anything, simply present, simply the same as he had been every morning at the east window, every evening at the fence line, and every silence that had asked nothing and given everything. She looked back at Aldgate. I'll get my things, she said. Beckett's hand moved the smallest movement, a fraction of a reach toward her arm that stopped itself before it completed. She saw it. She did not look at it. She looked at her sisters, one at a time. Cecily understood immediately, and the understanding moved across her face like a fist and was contained. Petra understood half a second later and looked at the porch floor. Hattie looked between Marin and Cecily and began to understand slowly, which was the worst kind of understanding. Beckett, Marin said, turning to him. Her voice was precisely level. If you're arrested tonight, there will be no one positioned to reach Fort Laramie tomorrow. He looked at her. She held his gaze for exactly as long as she needed to. Then she went inside. The trunks were smaller, going back. There hadn't been time to fully unpack. The sisters moved through the rooms in a silence that had nothing peaceful about it. The silence of people who are not saying the things that need saying because this is not the time, and there may not be another time, and the only thing available is to keep moving. Beckett stood at the gate as the Aldgate coach came to collect them. His 3 brothers stood in a line behind him, and if the expression on Grady's face was a specific kind of terrible, it was because he understood exactly what Marin had done and exactly what it cost, and he had the particular helplessness of a person watching someone else pay a price. They would have paid themselves if they'd been allowed to. The coach door opened. The sisters went in. Marin was last. She stopped at the gate 3 feet from Beckett. She did not look at him the way someone looks when they are uncertain. She looked at him the way someone looks when they are memorizing something. He did not speak. He was not a man who spoke in these moments. His hands were at his sides and his face was very still, and he looked back at her with the same attention he brought to everything that mattered to him. Complete, unhurried, not trying to be anything except exactly what he was. She nodded once. Then she got in the coach. The door closed. The horses moved. Beckett Hargrove stood at the gate of his father's ranch in the October afternoon and watched the coach move down the road and disappear, where the track curved south through the cottonwoods, and he stood there for a long time after the sound of it had gone. His right hand found the watch. He opened it, read the inscription. The same 4 words that had lived on the inside of that cover for 30 years, worn smooth and permanent. A man's word is his bond. He closed it, held it in his fist. Then he went to saddle his horse. There is a particular kind of darkness that exists on the Wyoming plain in October between 10 o'clock at night and the first gray suggestion of dawn. It is not the darkness of enclosed spaces, not a room with the lamp out, not a mine shaft, not a cellar. It is the darkness of open country under cloud cover, where the horizon has vanished and the ground and the sky are the same deep unlit black, and you are moving through it by memory and feel rather than sight. Riders who have grown up on this land learn early that the horse knows more than they do in such darkness. You give the animal the reins, and you trust the particular knowledge that lives in its feet, and you ride. Beckett had been riding this way since he was 11 years old. He cut south from the ranch along the creek bed, then angled west where the land opened into the long, shallow basin that ran parallel to the main road, but sat below the ridgeline. Nobody traveled this route at night. There was no reason to know town, no water, nothing, unless you knew that it ran faster than the road by a full half-mile and that the old crossing at the wooden bridge came out exactly at the point where the main track curved north toward town. He knew. He pushed the horse hard through the dark basin, riding by the sound of water to his left and the slight variation in ground texture beneath the hooves, and he did not think about whether this was wise or whether the odds were favorable or whether there was a better option available. There was not. There was only this option, and the willingness to take it, and willingness had never been a problem for Beckett Hargrove. The bridge appeared as a slightly darker shape against the dark ground. He came up the creek bank onto the track and pulled the horse to a stop and waited. He heard the coach before he saw it. The particular sound of it, two horses, the specific weight of a coach on a dry track, the jingle of a particular harness was distinct in the flat quiet of the night. He waited. The lamp on the front of the coach appeared around the bend like a small, swaying star. He rode into the middle of the track and held there. The coach driver saw him with enough time to stop properly, which Beckett had calculated before he left. The horses stamped and blew. The driver, a hired man named Yunt, who had no stake in any of this beyond the night's wages, looked down at the lone figure blocking the track and made the practical assessment that this was not worth dying for. The door of the coach opened before anyone could speak. Marin stepped out onto the track in the October dark without a lamp, without a coat over her traveling dress, without any visible preparation for being outside in the middle of the night. She stood on the packed dirt road with the coach lamp throwing a small circle of orange light around her, and she looked at him on the horse and she said in a voice that was quiet but not uncertain, "You shouldn't have come." He dismounted. "I know," he said, "but I have a plan, and the plan requires you." She looked at him. In the orange light, her face was very clear, and the expression on it was not surprise. She had known he thought that this moment was possible. She had accounted for it the way she accounted for everything, with a clear-eyed acknowledgement of likelihood. She simply hadn't known if he would act on it. "Tell me," she said. He told her. Fort Laramie was 18 miles west. Theo had the telegraph message drafted, a full account properly structured, addressed to U.S. Marshal Harrison in Cheyenne, detailing the substance of the Callaway case and the evidence held by Abernathy in Boston, and requesting federal attention before the territorial court system could be influenced by a man with the money and patience to influence it. Holbrook had been making inquiries through the Pinkerton Boston office for 3 days. But the telegraph would establish a federal record, and a federal record changed the geometry of everything Allgate could subsequently do. "To send it," Beckett said, "I need to sign a financial guarantee. If the case proceeds to federal court and we lose, the ranch is forfeited as security for the legal costs." He paused. "I need your signature alongside mine on the communication to Marshal Harrison. You are the complainant. Without your name on it, it's a neighbor's accusation. With your name on it, it's a formal petition from the injured party." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "If we lose the federal case, you lose the ranch." "Yes." "Your father's ranch." "Yes." She looked at him with an expression he had seen only once before in the kitchen in lamplight, when she had told him about the letter she had never read. The composure was there, but the thing behind it was fully visible, which he had come to understand was not weakness in her, but the opposite. She only let things be visible when she had decided they were worth the cost of visibility. "I can't ask you to do this," she said. "You didn't ask me," he said. "I'm telling you." In the coach behind her, he could see the faint shapes of her 3 sisters through the window glass. Cecily's face was turned toward them. The others were still. "My father built that land," he said. 22 years of it. He cleared it and fenced it and bled for it, and he died on it alone because his son was doing a treat that was honest and necessary, but was not being there." He looked at her in the lamplight. He didn't build it so it could sit there unchanged while four women get dragged back to Boston by a man who already stole everything they had once. He paused. He built it to mean something. I'd like it to mean something. The October wind moved through the cottonwoods along the creek. Dry leaves turned in the dark. Marin stood on the track for a long moment. She was not deciding whether to go, he understood that. She was deciding whether to let him pay this price, which was a different question entirely, and one she took seriously in a way that some people never took anything seriously. Then she turned back to the coach door. "Cecily," she said, "get the others. We're going to Fort Laramie." There are memories that fix themselves in complete detail, not just the main event, but everything around it, the full sensory surround, so that decades later, you can close your eyes and be entirely back in that moment. The smell of the air, the specific quality of the light, the sound of breathing beside you in the dark. These are not the memories you choose. They choose you. The ride to Fort Laramie chose all 8 of them. It was 18 miles on an October night with a cloud cover that came and went and let the stars through in irregular intervals, and the wagon moved at a pace that was faster than comfort, but slower than recklessness. And Beckett drove with Marin beside him on the front bench and the other 6 in the wagon bed behind them, with the trunks and 2 extra blankets that Grady had thought to throw in before they left. They did not speak much. The night did not require speech. It required presence, and presence was something all 8 of them were providing in full. In the wagon bed, Grady sat with Cecily's shoulder against his in a way that had not been arranged and was not commented on. He had been watching her face when the coach door opened and Marin stepped out, and he had seen the exact moment Cecily understood what her oldest sister had done and why, and the expression that had moved across Cecily's face in that moment was one he intended to remember for the rest of his life. Not because it was beautiful, though it was, because it showed him what this woman was made of at the depth of her, and that was a thing worth knowing about a person. He did not say any of this. He sat with her shoulder against his and watched the dark Wyoming plain move past them and did not say a word because some things are better said later when there is room for them. Theo sat with the telegraph message in his inside coat pocket and Petra beside him holding the lamp so he could read it one more time by its light. He had written it with the careful precision he brought to everything, not overwrought, not sparse, exactly as long as it needed to be, and no longer. The kind of document that would be read by a man who received many documents and had learned to identify the ones that required attention. Petra had corrected his spelling of Abernathy. He had thanked her without embarrassment. She had looked at this message afterward, reading it all the way through, and nodded once the kind of nod that meant it was right, which from her meant more than most people's extensive praise. Fletcher sat across from them with Hattie, who had her arms wrapped around herself against the cold, and was looking up at the sky between the clouds with the expression she brought to most things, open, unguarded, finding something in whatever was in front of her. She pointed out Orion when the clouds parted enough to show it. The hunter. Moving west same as they were. Fletcher said he'd always thought of Orion as someone who knew where he was going, and Hattie said she thought so too, and they rode in the companionable silence of 2 young people who have not yet learned to overcomplicate the things that are simple. Up front, Beckett held the reins in his left hand and kept his right at his side close to Marin, but not touching her. She had her arms folded against the cold, the Bible pressed against her side under her left arm, where she always carried it. Neither of them spoke for a long stretch of miles. The clouds broke open somewhere around the 10th mile, and the stars came all the way out, full extravagant, the whole width of the Wyoming sky blazing with the particular generosity that flat and treeless country allows. Marin looked up. The cold made her breath visible for a moment, a small cloud that dispersed. He would have liked this, she said. Not to him specifically. To the night. He knew she meant her father. What was he like? Beckett said. She thought about this for a moment. Patient. Curious about everything. He could spend an hour looking at the way water moved around a stone in a creek and come away with 3 new ideas. She paused. He laughed easily, more than most people. It surprised people who knew him only by reputation. They expected someone stern. Another pause. He was not stern. My father was like that, Beckett said. People thought quiet meant hard. He wasn't hard. He just didn't talk unless he had something to say. She turned and looked at the side of his face. You're like that, she said. He said nothing. She almost smiled. That was a compliment. I know, he said. I was thinking about whether it was accurate. She did smile, then briefly contained but real. She looked back at the road ahead. They rode the last 8 miles mostly in silence, and it was the best kind of silence that exists between two people, the kind that has no discomfort in it at all. Fort Laramie at 4 in the morning was not a lively place. The telegraph office occupied a small building near the main gate, staffed at that hour by a young man named Pruitt, who was asleep in his chair with his boots on and a copy of a dime novel face down on his chest. He came awake quickly when Theo knocked, blinking and professional enough to recover his composure before he'd fully found his feet. He lit 2 extra lamps without being asked. He cleared the operator's table. He read Theo's message once, and his eyebrows went up slightly, and then came back down, and he sat at his instrument with the expression of a man who understood that some messages were more significant than others, and that the telegraph operator's job was to transmit accurately and not to editorialize. Theo stood beside the table and read the message aloud, section by section, while Pruitt translated it into the instrument's measured clicking. The sound of it in the small room, precise, rhythmic, carrying each word away into the wire that ran east toward Cheyenne, was unlike any other sound Beckett had ever heard. Something between language and music. Information moving at a speed the human voice couldn't match across distances a horse would take days to cover. When it was done, Theo looked up. We should have a response within the hour if Marshal Harrison's night operator is attentive. He's attentive, Holbrook said from the doorway. He had followed them from Copper Creek on his own horse, arriving 20 minutes behind. He was not disheveled because Holbrook was not a man who permitted himself to appear disheveled. But something in his expression had settled into a different configuration than the professional neutrality he'd maintained for 2 weeks. He looked like a man who had made a decision and was at peace with having made it. I contacted the Boston office 3 days ago, he said, coming into the room, through official channels. Routine verification inquiry, confirmation of a solicitor's existence and standing. He stood near the wall with his hat in his hands. Abernathy and Associates is a functioning practice. The senior partner confirmed through my Boston contact that he holds materials deposited by one Gerald Calloway and that those materials remain intact and under seal pending instruction from an authorized party. The room was quiet for a moment. You went around Allgate, Grady said. I conducted an independent verification relevant to the accuracy of my original assignment. Holbrook's voice was even. I was hired to locate 4 women and confirm their welfare. Their welfare, I have concluded, is not served by the man who hired me. He looked at Marin directly for the first time since Broken Spur Ranch. Miss Calloway, I've been in this work for 19 years. I have done things in the course of it that I am proud of and things that I am not. I would prefer this one to fall in the first category. He paused. When Marshal Harrison responds to your telegraph, he will find a corroborating report from the Pinkerton agency already waiting in his office. I sent it yesterday morning. Marin looked at him for a long moment. Thank you, she said. The same 2 words she had said to Beckett on the porch in the dark more than 2 weeks ago. But the weight of them had changed because the circumstances had changed and because she herself had changed in some way that she would need more time and more distance to fully understand. She sat down at the cleared table. Pruitt slid a pen in the signature sheet across to her. She looked at it, at the line where her name was supposed to go, at the words above the line which identified her as Margaret Calloway, daughter of Gerald Calloway, inventor of Boston, Massachusetts, currently residing at Broken Spur Ranch, Copper Creek, Wyoming Territory. She picked up the pen. She wrote her name in full, not Margaret, not Marin, but the complete formal name her father had given her, the name he had called her on her first day of school, and on her last birthday before his arrest, and in every letter she had never received. She wrote it with the deliberate care of someone inscribing something permanent, and when she set the pen down, her hand was steady and her face was clear. Beckett signed below her, then he signed the financial guarantee on the separate sheet, the one that put Broken Spur Ranch on the line with the same hand and the same steadiness, without pause or ceremony. Pruitt gathered the documents. The lamp above the table threw their 2 signatures in sharp relief on the white paper side by side, the ink still dark and new. Outside, the eastern sky had begun to show the first faint difference between black and very dark blue. Not light yet, but the suggestion that light was under consideration. Beckett held the door open. Marin walked through it into the cold pre-dawn air. and stood outside the telegraph office and looked east at the horizon where that faint change was happening, and she breathed. He came to stand beside her. He took her hand. He did it the way he did most things, without announcement, without particular emphasis. Simply a decision made and carried out. Her fingers were cold. He held them in his without speaking. She looked at the horizon. He looked at it with her. Aldgate arrived at Fort Laramie at 9:30 in the morning, which was faster than they had expected. He brought 2 lawyers and his own horse this time, which meant he had not slept and had ridden straight through the night when his informant told him where the coach had gone. He was dusty and slightly diminished by it, the first time in 2 weeks that the impeccable surface had shown a crack. He went directly to the telegraph office where Pruitt informed him politely that transmissions could not be recalled or canceled once sent and received, and that any concerns about the content of sent messages would need to be addressed through proper federal channels. Aldgate received this information with a controlled expression and asked to use the telegraph himself. Pruitt obliged. Aldgate sent 2 messages, one to his lawyer in Boston and one to a judge in Laramie City with whom he had a relationship that he believed was reliable. Then he came outside to where the 8 people from Broken Spur Ranch were standing near the horses in the morning light, and he stood 10 feet away and looked at them, and what he saw was not what he had expected to see. He had expected fear, perhaps not visible fear. Marin was not a person who displayed fear, but the particular kind of internal retreat that fear produces, the slight pulling back, the orientation toward exit. He had managed her through that mechanism for 2 years. He understood it well. She was not retreating. She stood with her sisters on one side and the Hargrove brothers on the other, and she held the Bible against her side with one arm and stood with her shoulders squared, and she looked at him the way she had once years ago, before all of this, when she was young enough to look at him without history between them directly, without performance, without trying to be anything except what she was. He stopped a few feet away and looked at her. And in that moment, in spite of everything, in spite of the lawyers and the mortgage note and the 2 weeks of careful maneuvering, he saw Gerald, the angle of her jaw, the way she held very still when she was prepared for something. Gerald had stood like that in his workshop when a problem was about to resolve, when the solution was present, but not yet named. It was an expression of arrival. He had not let himself look at her directly since he arrived in Wyoming. He understood now why. "It's over, Marin," he said. But even as he said it, in the particular silence of the Fort Laramie morning, the words sounded different than he had intended. Not a warning, not a declaration. Something else entirely. Something that sounded almost like exhaustion. Like a man who had carried something heavy for a very long time and had just reached the end of the road on which he'd agreed to carry it. She stepped forward, not toward him exactly, toward the space between them, which was not the same thing. She held the Bible in the crook of her arm, and her voice when she spoke was not raised and not theatrical because it didn't need to be. What she said was clear enough without any of that. "You knew my father for 30 years, she said. He trusted you with everything, with the patent, with the business, with us. He trusted you the way people only trust someone they've believed in for a very long time." Aldgate said nothing. A muscle in his jaw moved. "And you took all of it," she said. "You took the patent, and you took his reputation, and you took his life in the end, because a prison cell with a chest illness and no medical care is still a death. You took every letter he wrote me." Her voice was entirely steady. "I want you to understand something. Not for your benefit, for mine." She looked at him with the same eyes she had used to look at everything in the last 3 weeks, the ranch at dawn, the East Ridge, her sisters' faces, Beckett's hands on the reins in the dark. Clear, unsentimental, entirely present. You could not take what he left inside that Bible. You didn't know it existed, and even if you had, you wouldn't have understood what it was, because what he left was not just a reference sheet. It was the knowledge that he was still thinking about us, still working to protect us in the last months of his life, when he had nothing left to work with but his own mind and whatever paper they allowed him. She paused. "You can't take that. You never could have taken that." Aldgate stood very still. "The truth about your father's work will be established in a federal proceeding," she said. "The documentation exists and it is intact, and the man who holds it is willing to testify. Whatever outcome follows from that, whatever the courts decide, the record will show who Gerald Calloway was and what he actually built." She stopped. She had said what she needed to say. She did not fill the silence after it. Aldgate looked at her for a long moment. Something moved through his face, several things in succession, none of them simple. Then he looked at Beckett, who had been standing 3 feet to Marin's right through all of this and had said nothing because nothing needed to be added to what she had said. Beckett looked back at him. His expression was not hostile. It was something harder to argue with than hostility, the face of a man who has already made his peace with the outcome and is simply waiting for the world to catch up. Aldgate looked at Agent Holbrook, who met his eyes briefly and said nothing. He turned and walked back to his horse. He mounted without assistance, which required some effort after the long night's ride, but was apparently necessary. He straightened in the saddle. He looked at the road south toward Copper Creek. He did not look back. The hoofbeats on the packed Fort Laramie ground faded and were replaced by the ordinary sounds of an October morning wind in the cottonwoods along the Laramie River, the distant sound of the post-changing horses, someone hammering something inside one of the buildings. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Fletcher exhaled loudly. "Right," he said to no one in particular. Hattie took his hand. He looked down at their joined hands with the expression of someone discovering an unexpected but welcome fact about the arrangement of the world. Grady looked at Cecily. Cecily looked back at him. Something had been shifting between them for 2 weeks by degrees, and in the particular morning light of Fort Laramie, after a night that had required everything from everyone, the remaining distance between them closed without either of them making a specific decision to close it. Theo stood apart from the group, as was his habit, watching the road where Aldgate had gone. Petra came to stand up beside him. She did not say anything. She put her hand through his arm, the way people do when they want to signal presence without demanding response, and she stood there with him in the morning light and looked at the same empty road. He put his hand over hers. 3 weeks passed, then a month. Marshal Harrison's office in Cheyenne responded to the telegraph within 4 hours of its receipt. The formal communication that followed arriving at Copper Creek by post 8 days later was precise and official and thorough. And when Theo finished reading it aloud at the kitchen table, there was a silence of about 30 seconds, and then Cecily said something unladylike that made Hattie cover her mouth and Grady laugh harder than he had in years. The investigation into Cornelius Aldgate's business practices was formally opened. The materials held by Abernathy were subpoenaed by federal order. The guardianship document was referred to the Massachusetts court for review on grounds of potential fraud, a review that the Massachusetts court, under federal scrutiny, conducted with considerably more thoroughness than Aldgate had anticipated. The forged marriage contract was declared invalid within a month. Andrews came to Broken Spur Ranch on a Thursday afternoon with a letter from the bank confirming that the mortgage note had been returned to its original terms, Aldgate's purchase of it having been deemed part of an ongoing fraud proceeding. He sat at the kitchen table and drank the coffee Marin put in front of him and looked like a man who had spent several weeks being considerably less comfortable than he appeared at the moment. "I should have asked more questions," he said. "When a man arrives in a town he's never been to and pays off his neighbor's debts before he's been there 48 hours, that is not a neighborly instinct. That is a transaction." "It is," Beckett said. "I know that now." Andrew set down his cup. "I knew it then, if I'm honest. I chose not to examine it." He looked at Beckett. "I'm sorry for that." Beckett nodded, the kind of nod that accepted the apology without requiring more from it. Andrews left. Beckett looked at the letter from the bank. He folded it. He put it on the kitchen shelf where the important papers lived. He reached into his vest pocket. The watch was there, same as always. He took it out and held it for a moment, reading the inscription, the way he had read it 1,000 times each reading, wearing the words a little smoother, pressing them a little deeper into whatever part of a person holds such things. Then he put it back in his pocket. He left it there. He had not made a ritual of this. He had not announced it. He had simply found in the weeks following Fort Laramie that the habit of reaching for it, the reflexive, anxious reaching that had been his private companion through 8 years of solitary responsibility, was less frequent. And when he did reach for it, it was not from habit, but from intention. Not to hold on to something, but to remember something, which was different. He took her up to Copper Ridge on a morning when the frost was still on the grass, and the sky was the pale, luminous blue that the high country gives to November mornings, the kind of cold clarity that arrives after the last of autumn's color has gone, and the world settles into something starker and more honest. He had mentioned it once weeks earlier, the way the ranch looked from the high ground before dawn, the way the valley opened below and the cottonwoods ran silver along the creek, and the whole world seemed both very large and somehow manageable, as though from that height the proportion of things became briefly correct. He had said he would take her there someday. She had nodded and not replied. He had not known if she was interested or simply being polite until he found her in the kitchen at 4:30 on a Tuesday morning, already in her riding coat. They rode up in the dark, which was the only way to get there in time for what he wanted her to see. The horses knew the trail. The cold was clean and particular, the kind of cold that feels like a specific statement rather than simply the absence of warmth. The ridge came up beneath them as the first absolute edge of light appeared in the east. Not sunrise yet, the arrival of the idea of sunrise, the east changing its mind about whether it intended to stay dark. He stopped his horse. She stopped hers beside him. Below them, Broken Spur Ranch lay in the valley, in the last of the dark, the main house, the barn and outbuildings, the fencing in its geometric lines, the creek running along the eastern boundary, catching what little light existed and giving it back. The cottonwoods were bare now. The smoke from the kitchen stove where Theo had risen early rose straight and narrow in the still air. It was not a grand view. It was not scenery designed to impress. It was a working ranch in a Wyoming valley at the beginning of a cold November morning, and it was entirely ordinary and entirely beautiful in the way that things are beautiful when they have been earned. He looked at it for a while. Then he said, "I read your letters 47 times. She turned to look at him. "Not because I forgot them," he said. "Every time I read them again, I found something I'd missed." He was looking at the valley the way he looked at the things that mattered most, with his full attention directed somewhere neutral so the words had a clear path. "The 47th time I noticed you'd never written about what you wanted. Only what you were willing to do, what you could offer, what you'd accept." He paused. "I think that was because nobody had asked." He turned and looked at her. She was looking back at him. The light was coming up slowly, touching the highest ground first, and working its way down, and in that early light, her face was very clear and very present. "What do you want, Marin?" She looked at the valley. She looked at the sky, which was now moving through a progression of pale colors that had no adequate names. She looked at the horses standing quiet in the cold. She looked at the smoke from the kitchen stove rising straight and narrow, visible from up here. In a way, it wasn't from the ground. Then she looked at him. "I want to stay," she said. "Here. I want mornings like this one. I want to see this in all the seasons, the winter, which I imagine is considerable, and the spring when it comes back." She paused. "I want to know what my father's name sounds like when it's said with pride instead of apology. I want my sisters to have what they're finding here." She looked at him steadily. "And I want to be beside you when you come back from wherever it is you go, when you stand at your father's grave and talk to someone who isn't there anymore." The ridge was very quiet. Somewhere below, a meadowlark late in the season, the last one or nearly called once from the grass. "That's a great deal to want," he said. "I know," she said. "I've been conservative about wanting things for a long time. I thought I should compensate." He looked at her for a moment. Something shifted in his face, not the expression of a man who had been holding something back, but the expression of a man who had been waiting for the right moment and had just recognized it. "That seems like a reasonable approach," he said. She almost laughed. "Almost." "Marin Calloway," he said, and then he stopped. He was not a man who spoke in circles, and he was not going to start now. "Stay. That's what I'm asking. Not because the ranch needs it, though it does. Not because we signed our names together on a piece of paper, though we did. Because I have been reading your letters and watching you at the east window and sitting beside you in the dark, and I am a better man in the world with you in it than I was before you stepped off that train." He paused. "And I would like a long time to keep being that man if you'll allow it." She looked at him. She had composed herself through a great many things in the weeks since Boston. The coach ride, the midnight road, the telegraph office at 4 in the morning, the confrontation at Fort Laramie in the early light. She had managed every one of those things with the controlled steadiness she had spent years developing, because the steadiness had been necessary and she had been the person required to provide it. She was not providing it now. What was on her face instead was simpler and older and considerably harder to manage, and she did not try to manage it. She let it be visible the way she had let things be visible on the few occasions when she had decided the cost of visibility was worth paying. Yes, she said, that was all, one word. But it was the words said with the voice she used for true things, and it was enough. Below them, the sun cleared the eastern ridge. It came across the valley in a long wave of gold, touching the frost on the grass, first burning it off in thin curls of mist, then finding the cottonwoods along the creek and the roof of the main house, and the open fields, and then reaching the ridge where they sat and laying itself across the two of them, and the horses and the ground and all the country visible in every direction, and for a moment everything was the same pale burning gold. There was a corner of the eastern pasture where the fence turned north, and a single large cottonwood stood apart from the others that caught the first light of every morning before any other part of the ranch. Beckett's father had known this and had placed his marker there intentionally, which was the kind of thing a man does when he has thought carefully about where he would like his name to exist in the world after he is gone. Beckett went there alone one morning in December, when the frost was harder than it had been, and his breath made clouds that lasted longer in the air before dispersing. He stood at the marker for a while without speaking. The light was coming up the way it always did from the east orange gold, hitting the top of the cottonwood first and working its way down. He had come here often in the years since 1871, more often than he'd admitted to anyone. Not every day, not even every week. But when the weight of things became particular, when the ledger was red, or the weather had cost them something, or a decision needed making that he wasn't certain about, he came here. He had not examined this habit too closely. He had not needed to. "Pa," he said. His voice was quiet. The frost-stiffened grass around the marker was very still. "The ranch is here. The note's clear. We came through." The cottonwood above him moved slightly in some altitude of wind that hadn't reached the ground yet. A few remaining leaves turned. The light continued its slow work down the trunk. 3 weddings before spring, it looks like. Fletcher and Hattie want to wait until she's 19, which is sensible. Grady and Cecily before Christmas, Cecily's idea, which surprised nobody. He paused. Theo and Petra in February. Theo wants to write his own vows, which I told him was ambitious. He told me I wasn't qualified to comment, and he's probably right. The light reached the roots of the cottonwood and spread across the ground. And Marin and I, well. He was quiet for a moment, the particular quiet of a man choosing his words not because they were difficult to find, but because they were the most important ones he had said in a long time. I asked her this morning, before we came down off the ridge. She said yes. He paused. I don't have a date yet. She said spring when the grass comes back. Said she wanted the valley to look the way I described it in my first letter. He looked up at the bare branches of the cottonwood. She's read that letter more times than she'll admit. I found it in her coat pocket last week. Didn't say anything about it. Some things don't need to be said. The light continued to spread. I'm not going to tell you how I felt when I stood at that gate and watched that coach go down the road. He stopped for a moment. I think you know. I think that's a feeling men in this family understand without needing a description. He reached into his vest pocket. The watch was there, smoothed and worn, the silver warm from his body heat, despite the cold morning. He took it out. He opened it for the last time in the way he had been opening it for 8 years, not to read the time, but to read the other thing. The 4 words pressed into the metal. The testament his father had carried before him, the thing he had tried to honor by staying, by working, by refusing to let the land become something less than it had been. A man's word is his bond. He read it. He thought about the telegraph office at Fort Laramie and the pen in his hand and the paper that asked him to put up everything his father had built. He thought about how long he had stood outside in the dark before he went in. Not because he was afraid, fear had not been the issue. Because he had wanted to do it honestly with the full knowledge of what it cost rather than in a hurry with his eyes half closed. He thought about going in. He thought about what it had been worth. He closed the watch. He held it for a moment, feeling the weight of it in his palm, the weight of the metal, and the weight of everything the metal represented. 22 years of his father's daily life, 8 years of his own. Then he put it in his pocket, not the vest pocket where it had lived within reach for 8 years. The coat pocket deeper where it would sit against his ribs and be kept, but not constantly consulted. Where it would be a thing he carried rather than a thing he needed. He looked at the marker for another moment. You would have liked her, he said. She's the kind of person you would have liked. She doesn't say things she doesn't mean, and she doesn't flinch from the hard version of the truth. He paused. She drinks her coffee black, and she was at the east window before I was this morning. Hasn't happened before. I think she's getting used to Wyoming. A beat. Or Wyoming is getting used to her. Hard to say which way that goes. He put his hat on. I'll bring her up here in the spring, he said, when the grass comes back. I'd like her to meet you that way with the valley looking its best. Feels right. He turned and walked back toward the house. The sun was fully up now, the gold spreading across the entire valley, touching everything it could reach. The main house stood solid and unchanged in the morning light, the same as it had been when his father built it, and the same as it would be when he was gone. Logs and mud, chink, and a porch that faced east, a door that opened into a kitchen that smelled of coffee and wood smoke. A house that had been a place to sleep for a long time and was now, in the way that these things happen, without announcement, a home. From the porch, Marin saw him coming across the field. She was standing in the doorway with 2 cups of coffee, wearing her coat over her dress because she had come outside in a hurry when she saw where he had gone, which she understood now, having watched him for 6 weeks with the particular attention she brought to things she wanted to understand completely. She watched him cross the frost-pale field toward the house, and the expression on her face was the one he had been building toward since the first morning at the east window. Open, present, entirely herself, no composure required, because composure was for the outside world, and this was not the outside world anymore. He came through the gate. She held out the cup. He took it. Their fingers touched in the exchange for a moment longer than necessary. He stood beside her in the cold morning air and drank his coffee and looked out at the valley that was his, that had always been his, that was now also hers, and he did not reach for the watch. If you have built something worth keeping, a stretch of land, a family, a life assembled piece by piece from the available materials of your particular years, you understand what Beckett Hargrove understood that morning. Not the romantic version of it, the real version. The one that lives in the body rather than the imagination, in the specific weight of a cup in your hand, and the specific cold of a December morning, and the specific presence of a person standing close enough that you can feel the warmth of them, even in the frost. You build things because you were built to build them. Because something in your particular makeup requires the making of something that will outlast the season, outlast the worry, outlast you if you're fortunate and you've done it right. And if you are lucky, genuinely, unreasonably lucky, the kind of luck that has nothing to do with cards or weather or the price of cattle, in any given year, you do not do it alone. Marin Calloway had traveled 2,000 miles on a train and a wagon and a midnight road with the cold coming off the Wyoming plain like a warning, and she had arrived at a gate on the eastern edge of Copper Creek Valley with her sisters beside her, and a Bible in her arms, and a father's last message hidden in the spine of it, and she had stayed. Not because she had nowhere else to go, because she had looked at a man who drove in silence and held his father's watch and said exactly what he meant, and no more, and she had recognized in him something she had not expected to find anywhere, and certainly not here, and certainly not like this. Something that felt for the first time in 2 years like the opposite of alone. If you know what that feels like, if you have ever stood in the cold morning light beside a person who chose to stand there with you, not from obligation or arrangement or any of the practical calculations that bring people together, but from the accumulated weight of 10,000 small, honest moments, then you already know how the story ends. It ends the same way all the true ones do, with coffee going cold because nobody is in any hurry to go inside, with the sun on the frost, with the day beginning.